because the first few cases were homosexual men in New York. And it took a long time for scientists to begin to recognize the AIDS epidemic and to understand what AIDS was. And part of the reason why it took a long time relates to human rights, because at a very senior level of government, there was a reluctance to deal with a problem that affected gay men. Homosexual men were seen as being morally corrupt, and so government resources were not put towards finding out what the epidemic was. And part of the reason, I would argue, that we have AIDS in Indonesia, or AIDS in Africa, or AIDS in, well, maybe not Africa, but AIDS in other countries, is because the US failed to move quickly enough to deal with the epidemic when it first started. And so that homosexual men were seen as being, we lose a few, it's not a big problem, right? And it really took years of fighting and years of advocacy for the disease to be taken seriously. And in fact, then President Reagan of the United States never mentioned the AIDS epidemic until right before he left office. So it was very late in his tenure that he even said the word HIV/AIDS. Okay, so HIV/AIDS is a kind of virus that attacks the immune system. So it attacks the system that protects you from other viruses. As far as we know, it began in Africa with chimpanzees, which may sound strange if you haven't heard this already, but actually many of the worst epidemics begin with animals and then cross over into humans. And that's actually quite common in places where humans and animals live closely together in rural areas, that a disease can migrate from animal population to humans. For instance, SARS was a case like that, right? Or avian flu is another case. So it's quite common for diseases to spread in that manner. And they are also upperclassmen. And so this was a relatively, even though they were very marginalized because they were homosexual, they were relatively powerful. These are people who had jobs, who had education, who had access to lawyers, who had access to doctors. And so they were able to combat the epidemic. They were able to organize themselves into NGOs. They were able to fight for better government policies. And they were able to educate and inform one another. We had massive. HIV/AIDS is now not so common among gay men in the United States. But what happened is, as the epidemic spread, it moved from this more elite group of white, well-to-do men into more marginalized groups, to not educated, who do not have good doctors, who do not have good water or good sanitation, the people on the margins of society. And so today there are about 33.2 million people in the world living with HIV. About over 2 million people have died of AIDS, including 330,000 children. And in Indonesia, I believe the current number is 290,000 people living with HIV/AIDS. It's still a relatively small number, but growing quite quickly in Indonesia, partly because of drug use. And AIDS, as I said, has tended to affect people who are marginal and who have very little political power. It tends to affect women and girls quite a bit. It tends to affect, in fact, men who have sex with men, which is a term that we use. There are a lot of special terms in the AIDS world. So I've written some of them up here. One is MSM, and I hope I'm not shocking you all too much. You're college students, you've talked about everything. Nothing new, right?
They know that already.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Live in Jakarta, right? MSM, right. So, and this phrase is used. Can anyone explain why we use this phrase? Why don't we just call them all gay men?
Or boys.
Or boys. Men or boys. Because not all men who have sex with men consider themselves gay or homosexual.
Okay.
And this is especially true, for instance, in China, where I've done a lot of work, and also in Thailand. Men will be married, they have families, they have children, but they may still have affairs with men.
Okay.
Right? So we use this phrase because anyone who has sex with men is then covered by that phrase. Some other phrases I have up here, just so you get to comfortable with the AIDS lingo. It's a lot of alphabet language. IDU, injection drug users, right? These are mostly people who are injecting heroin, or in some other way using a needle for drug use. PLWHA, it's a very long one and awkward one. People living with HIV/AIDS. We use this phrase because in the beginning people thought of AIDS as being a death sentence. If you had HIV/AIDS, you would die. And it was true then. It's not true now. Today, if you have good medication, you can live a productive life for 10 or 20 years and be healthy. So we try to emphasize that people are living with it. They're not dying with it, right? So people who have HIV like to call themselves people living with HIV/AIDS because it fights back against that stigma and that discrimination. Right? CSW, commercial sex workers, okay? More common terms would be prostitutes, right? But this phrase emphasizes that they're working. This is their job. They're not doing it for fun, right? So I'm going to emphasize these are people who are, for economic reasons, sex workers. Please.
Wasn't that abbreviation has been changed to just sex worker because when you use the term of work,
Right.
that means commercial.
Sure. Yeah.
So in Indonesia, we use the term
Just SW.
pekerja sex worker.
Oh, okay.
No longer we use pekerja seks komersial.
Because it's redundant. Yeah.
Because the work is synonym to the commercial.
Okay.
If you work, you will have earn something, either money or
Right.
anything.
All right.
That means commerciality.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's it. I didn't know that. So in other parts of the world, yeah, we use CSW, and different countries have different terminology. But just to get you used to seeing some of these initials. Okay. So I was talking about people who become more vulnerable to HIV/AIDS, such as sex workers, MSM, right? Women and girls, IDU, drug users, often immigrants, especially in countries where immigrants are more marginal, don't have much money, don't have citizenship rights. They can also be very vulnerable. Prisons are often very, very efficient ways to spread HIV because prisoners have very little information. They have very little power, right? They have no availability, no access to condoms. They don't have access to clean needles, but they may have access to drugs. And so prisons are often places where HIV is spread very, very widely. And so the idea is that these people who are vulnerable because they don't have human rights. And so the lack of human rights speeds up the AIDS epidemic. Tuberculosis, your body's not strong enough to fight it off. So usually you don't die of AIDS. You can't actually die of AIDS. You die of some other virus that you contract after being infected with HIV. And having HIV positive early on, you can start to take medications that can prolong your life for 10 or 20, 30 years. I think Magic Johnson, famous basketball player in the U.S., right? Had a lot of girlfriends at one point, got HIV, and is now, I think, has been HIV, and some bodily fluid. And that means it can be transmitted through sex, either homosexual sex or heterosexual sex. It can be transmitted through blood transfusions. So if your hospital does not test the blood for HIV, then a blood transfusion can transmit the virus. It can be transmitted from a mother who's HIV positive to her child, either during pregnancy or when the child is born, because there's blood and so forth as the child is being born, or through the breastfeeding, because breast milk can transmit HIV to the child.